I'm Sarah Kay Bierle for the Emerging Civil War podcast, filling in for Chris Mikowski. And today I have Cecily Nelson Zander joining me, JoAnna McDonald as well. And we're going to be chatting about leadership and the Civil War. So we pulled together some of the ladies who write for Emerging Civil War and are involved in other projects with the organization since it's Women's History Month. And we're going to let this be ladies' night on Zoom and on the podcast. And so let's get this discussion going. Let's talk about leadership moments in the Civil War. So is there a leadership moment that stands out to you? And Cecily, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll take a crack at it. And thanks as always for inviting me on the podcast. And it's great to see Civil War ladies out tonight. So I'm excited to be here. When Chris kind of put this question to me, my mind went to the Western theater, as it often does, of the war, and to George Thomas at Chickamauga, who I think has one of the great leadership moments of the war when he rallies some scattered remnants of Union troops and prolongs the Confederate assault long enough for the Army to make it back into Chattanooga. And I think Thomas is just a great example of a leader who develops during the Civil War. He's always great for students, right? Because he's a Virginian, comes from a large slaveholding family, but decides not to go with the South, like many of his sort of Virginian brothers at the start of the war, and at a great personal cost. Of course, there's the famous story of after his death, the United States Army going to the home of his sisters and saying that your brother has died, and his sisters responded, "Our brother died in 1861." And Thomas just shows this strength of character throughout the war, not only to stay with the Union, but then to become this person who rises from maybe someone whose abilities were doubted, who was considered slow and maybe not particularly capable, to someone who saves the Union Army at Chickamauga, completes and consolidates the Union victory at Chattanooga, and then leads the Army of the Cumberland for the remainder of the war. And then goes on in Reconstruction to be one of the first people to point out what's going on with the Ku Klux Klan, testifying before Congress about violence and outrages in the South, and is someone who just really, I think, flourishes as a result of the war. Is in one of those great stories, you tell the students that a lot of men didn't come into this war fully formed, and I think Thomas is one who really grows and flourishes out of the conflict. But that moment that stands out is Thomas at Chickamauga, saving the Union from an absolutely disastrous loss. And we won't say whether or not Braxton Bragg could have consolidated the loss. That's not the point. Thomas did help to save the Union Army on the second day of the battle.
Absolutely, and what a great leadership moment to feature. JoAnna, what leadership moment stands out to you in Civil War history?
Well, I had to write some notes. President Abraham Lincoln, I'm going to rewind all the way back to April of 1861. Those first 6 months were pivotal in the direction the North would take and how they would approach the war. The first three things Lincoln does is declare the South was involved in a insurrection. He named it insurrection. Mm-hmm. Then he calls up the militia to deal with that insurrection. Third thing, and he does this numerous times, he gives Scott permission to suspend habeas corpus, which is still one of those fun debates that historians go round and round and round. But
absolutely,
Lincoln was within the law of war, or what also is called the paradox of war. Mm-hmm. So those are within that first 6 months.
That's a great example, and I like how you draw in some themes there of the political leadership as well, and tying that then into the military connection. That's a really great observation. Well, I'm going to go with a Union man as well. We might have to do another round and see if we've got some Southern leadership ideas in there as well. Mm-hmm. But let's just keep things a little fair and balanced. But the leadership moment or person that I was thinking of this evening is Winfield Scott Hancock, who goes from being a military career in the pre-war army to promoting rapidly to brigadier general there early as McClellan's forming the Army of the Potomac, and then fighting well through the Peninsula Campaign, but he's not in high command. And yet we see him rise through the ranks, and looking at what men wrote about him and how he was this inspiring figure on the battlefield. He had the charisma, but he also had that determination and the skill set to be able to back it up. Where I think a lot of generals that we see, they kind of had one or the other. They had the skills, but maybe not the charisma, or they had lots of charisma and maybe not as much skill. And I think Hancock's an interesting blend of both, and how he manages to stay out of the really ugly politics, if you will, that embroil the Army of the Potomac, particularly in the winter, spring of 1863. And then, of course, I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with General Hancock at Gettysburg, helping to determine the defensive position and things like that. And arguably that might be one of his great leadership moments of the war. Certainly there's some flaws that we see with hindsight in that, but I think just his rise through leadership, his willingness to innovate, and his clear focus that they were fighting for something bigger than personal glory or personal gain. There's some quotes from him. There's all that infighting among the commanders in the army, and he's really focused on, this is about the nation. It's not about one man. And so that's one thing I've always admired about his leadership as well. Now, I noticed, JoAnna, that you got a big smile on your face when I said, maybe we should go another round to make sure some guys in gray get a little bit of time on the podcast. Did you want to go ahead and start? I know you've been doing some writing recently on a particular general in gray.
Well, of course, you cannot have a conversation like this without Robert E. Lee.
Right.
I actually picked out two pivotal moments. One it's May of 1861, and he and Davis are discussing military strategy and how they set up their foundation, which is it collapses. I discussed this in the book. I mean, it was from Lee's experience in education. He didn't do it obviously on purpose, but he really thinks this can work, where you defend Richmond and you win the war in one theater of war, rather than looking at, theater of operations, rather than looking at the theater of war, where you've got the West, sort of the back door, you can call it. And it's huge, it's pivotal. And then you have him, the beautiful moments in 1866. So I'm going to expand the Civil War. When part of the paradox Lee was involved in is that he helps win the peace, or at least what he can try to. And if you talk to any combat veteran, especially the ones who've come back from Afghanistan or Iraq, and winning the peace is just as important as winning the war. And Lee several times went to DC upon request from Congress to go sit there and listen to these guys yak on and ask him silly questions that he was not a sociologist. And one of the questions they asked him was, do you think the former slaves would be able to learn to read? Okay, well, and he was not a smart aleck to him. Mm-hmm. He was polite. I have a bad time with that. I would be like, I just, think about traveling that corridor in a buggy, and then you have to sit there and listen to the congressman ask you. I'll try to be polite and not use combat language, but just silly questions. Right. I do think if Lincoln had survived, Lincoln and Lee would have gotten together and really helped bring the country together, because Lincoln knew Lee, and wasn't to be.
And
Oh.
it is interesting to look at, and I really like how this discussion is going, and we're seeing some threads of pre-war and post-war coming in. I think that's such a great reminder that leadership didn't just happen on the battlefield with these guys. You know, it extended beyond, and they were doing things that they felt would be best for the good of their country. Of course, some of that might come under debate as we look at it later, but you know, from their perspective, they were trying to do things that they thought was right in that time and in that place.
Mhm.
So, Cecily, do you want to jump in with some thoughts or a Confederate leadership moment here?
Sure, I had a couple, and they're sort of quick, so I'll do both. And one of them sort of treads very close to Sarah's territory, so I don't want to. It's a battle of the wilderness, of course, and in the Widow Tapfield. Again, this is a moment with Lee, but I would also say James Longstreet. Obviously the famous Lee to the rear moment when Lee thinks they're almost collapsing. It's getting very, very close to the kind of breaking point, and Longstreet arrives at the right moment, which he often had the habit of doing. He did it at Second Manassas and he did it at Chickamauga. He's always kind of where he needs to be, but that lead to the rear moment of kind of putting aside, I'm the commander of this army, and if they need me to be at the front, I'll be at the front. And the men kind of rallying around him and saying, we'll go on. You don't have to risk your life. So I'd say that moment in the Widow Tapfield with Longstreet's great timing and Lee's kind of just commandability and magnetism. And then the other one that came to mind, and I'll stick in the vicinity of Fredericksburg, would be Edward Porter Alexander seizing the high ground at Hazel Grove at Chancellorsville. Just a phenomenal moment when he realized they were real dumb to abandon this position. So I'm going to get my guns up there as quickly as possible. And he said, he has the great quote in his memoirs, this is the part of a battle that may be denominated pie, to fire into the ranks of a retreating army. He was just kind of giddy. Alexander's a little bloodthirsty from time to time. This is one of the great kind of joys of his memoirs, but his sense of strategy, which makes his memoirs so enjoyable, also really paid off on that moment in terms of really giving the Confederates an even greater advantage in that fight, which, I think many would argue is the kind of masterpiece of the Army of Northern Virginia in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. Well, I will follow on the Chancellorsville thread a little bit there. And this is an area that I'm still kind of looking at, and I can't take credit for this being any type of an original idea. It's something that I've heard some of the guys at Emerging Civil War talking about as well, and I find it very intriguing. And that is the leadership moment where Jackson has been wounded and he is out of the picture at Chancellorsville. And Lee needs to find someone to command Jackson's corps, which it's the middle of the night. They're in great disarray. Lee's army is still fractured and divided. And who does he go to? He goes to a cavalry commander, and that's Jeb Stuart. And I find that very fascinating. And some of it might be a little bit of that personal connection because Lee and Stuart were close from the West Point days. Not that they were at West Point together. Stuart was there when Lee was superintendent. But also just how Stuart is able to kind of transition from being this cavalry leader to really doing a great job with infantry for that period. And that's very interesting. It's an intriguing Confederate leadership moment to me.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, we've gone a couple rounds here looking at leadership moments. So maybe we want to either step a little back, or maybe it also means getting a little closer to the battles here. But what are some leadership thought patterns that change or evolve positively or negatively as the Civil War unfolds? JoAnna, do you want to start with that? Share some thoughts, or we can circle back if you want to.
I think Sherman would be one that he's after he was in I believe Memphis, and there was some terrorist activity. He really kind of shifted gears and was like, okay, we're gonna have to break the will of the people. And no, Sherman didn't read Clausewitz. He was not fluent in German. I'm going to have an article on all that soon.
Well, we don't want to spoil your article. We want people to read it.
But then from there, he's going to develop his how to break the will of the people, where to break it, and balancing the violence. And that's another part of military theory that these generals have to think about. It's an ugly discussion, but it's about violence. But it's also about where do you put it so you don't go so far the other way that you have a perpetual civil war and you can never bring everybody back together. Now, again, I tell my friends who live in Georgia and South Carolina, no, you guys still feel it. I get it. Well, I don't get it in that I didn't live it. My relatives didn't live it, but I understand they still see it in that respect. But at the same time, my friends do realize that, but like Sherman said, they had to pull the intestines out. He was going into the intestine of the South and rip it apart. And that is something that I guess you could say evolved or devolved. I mean, that's just, that's a big one.
So JoAnna, do you see that as a total war mindset, or do you prefer a different term for where Sherman goes with his military thinking that you've just described?
Well, it's a comprehensive part of, if you look at what the Civil War was, complex, and it's just not a civil war. It's a national war for the North to keep the Union together, and for the South, technically it was a revolution, although they kind of ignore that part. That's just what they did. But at any rate, yeah. So he's total. I mean, I've gone to Sunday school and I've taught Sunday school, and if you look at the Old Testament, they've been total warring a lot. That's now he did not put salt everywhere that I know of. I mean, he might have, but
it's just one of those terms that we hear tossed around, and I know that different people have different feelings on the term.
Right. Yeah, I think comprehensive says what happened better than total. What does total mean? I mean, comprehensive.
Like a comprehensive.
It's in depth. He's going for the psychological aspect, not just the violence, but the psychological aspect of breaking the will of the civilians. Because Sherman understood, Grant understood, Lincoln understood. It's the civilians that support it. The military fights it. And the policymakers, I don't know what they were doing, but so yeah, I would say comprehensive, in depth.
Okay, that's really helpful. And Cecily, what do you think? Leadership thought patterns?
Yeah, so I was going to sort of do a compare and contrast on this. So I've been really heavily reading Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War testimony, but I'm reading it from the congressional side. So I'm sort of working on sort of how Republican leaders navigated the Civil War, and I think there's a kind of very interesting contrast in leadership thought patterns. Congressional Republicans, and especially the kind of radicals who made up a lot of the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, really created that committee because they didn't think that Union generals were doing enough to be aggressive. And so the kind of thought is that these leading Republican congressmen believed that there was only one strategy for waging the war, and that was you had to be constantly on the offensive and constantly being aggressive. They didn't have a sense of all the different things that can comprehensively go into fighting a war, and they disdained a West Point education because they believed it was aristocratic and oftentimes associated West Pointers with capital D Democrats and even pro-slavery. So there's a kind of a pattern amongst congressmen that they never learned to trust the leaders that they kind of have in place. They call up every commander of the Army of the Potomac in front of them, except Grant, who was kind of only right tangentially. He's not actually in command of it. They harangue McClellan, Fitzjohn Porter, even George Meade for not doing enough, not being aggressive enough. But then on the other hand, you have Abraham Lincoln, who goes from someone who probably would have told you, and I'm sure he jokingly did in 1861, he had no business being commander-in-chief of an army. He didn't have the experience, who learns to become a commander-in-chief who can trust his generals to do what needs to be done. And that's especially true in his relationship with Ulysses S. Grant. So Lincoln's kind of pattern of learning during the war, in contrast to his kind of Republican congressional colleagues who sort of never learned to trust military commanders and are actually kind of detrimental and wasting their time. George Meade has no reason to be sitting before this committee. He's got a campaign to prepare for. Lincoln gave them the space. He learned how to do that. But he also had a great guy in Grant who he could kind of implicitly trust. And of course, there's your contrast to Jefferson Davis. He couldn't let go. He couldn't let his commanders, except for Robert E. Lee, kind of do what they needed to do. He meddles and mismanages for much of the war because he believed he had enough military experience to do that. And so that's the kind of irony or the contrast, right? Is that Lincoln acknowledges his limits, but it's ultimately incredibly beneficial for the Union cause. So Lincoln's development as commander-in-chief, I think, a great leadership kind of thought pattern of someone who was humble enough to know their limits, but finally put his trust in the right people.
That's really fascinating. I was kind of thinking about how we see Navy and Army starting to work together and how it's not the first time it had been done by any means. Not even in US history is it a first time, but it is kind of this concept. You look at Winfield Scott, the old fuss and feathers from the Mexican War, not to be confused with W.S. Hancock, since I did mention him earlier. Anyway, his plan, which was called the Anaconda Plan, of using the waterways, and then working this maritime strategy with the Army. I think that's a really interesting concept that they start evolving. And it makes sense on paper, the way Scott has it drawn out, but then it's also going to evolve as it gets put into play practically, because some rivers are captured before others. And, it's kind of this whole, they're going to learn as they implement it. But I think it's a really interesting way of thought pattern changing in kind of that strategic look at the war. Mm-hmm. So now that we've kind of taken a high look at some of these examples, maybe we want to take a look at like more of the boots on the ground, the tactics, because that's something that comes up in lots of discussions. And I'm sure we've either all heard them or participated in them. But what are some tactical changes? And can we maybe talk about leaders who are there and part of the change? Is that something we could dive into? Cecily, do you want to go first?
Sure. I was thinking, by the end of the war, the change to entrenchments, which I think is something that people are always sort of stunned by, and especially students, when you show them pictures of Petersburg and they're like, is that Belgium? They think, that's the First World War, not the Civil War. So that kind of that shift to that trench warfare, which really, I think, fundamentally kicks off a reevaluation on the part of certainly the United States Army about conventional warfare. And think of someone like Emory Upton, who's having all these experiences and is kind of just really trying to work through what this is going to mean and what this is going to look like. And he comes out of the war and kind of struggles and wrestles with, how do we move forward from a conflict that started as, probably closer to the American Revolution, armies arrayed on a battlefield, to this comprehensive war but also one that involved digging in and tore up the landscape. I mean, fundamentally reoriented Southern society. I mean, I think they just come out of it kind of shocked at the change that the war wrought. But I would certainly say, sort of tactically, strategically, the kind of move to entrenchments and the consequences of that, because by the end of the siege of Petersburg, you have units who refuse to attack entrenched lines anymore because they've learned that lesson. And so, you know, the great story of I think the 10th Maine at Petersburg, who are told, don't go forward by the units on either side of them because it'll be a massacre, but they're new and raw and they don't know that they're not supposed to attack this entrenched position, and they do go forward, and it's something like 80% casualties, even though they've been told and warned. But it's just an example of how the character of the war had turned so deadly and kind of difficult, and how soldiers really dealt with that. They kind of went from very eager to make these assaults to kind of wary of it and even refusing to go forward, which is kind of a remarkable change. And ultimately, I think Lee's prediction, of course, comes true. If it turns into a siege, that's the end of the war for us. And Grant waited it out. And he waited it out with trenches and digging in, and finally, the ultimate capitulation at Appomattox. But so that would be, I guess, the first that comes to mind for me. So tactically, strategically on the ground, the move to entrenchments, that the kind of change in the character of the war.
That's a great observation, and I really appreciate how you described that and added some new language to it as well. JoAnna, thoughts from you on these more boots on the ground type of developments?
Yeah, I'm going to stick with infantry as well. It's interesting, the whole concept that the Napoleonic tactics, you were technically supposed to fire once and then bayonet charge. Mm-hmm. That was what you were supposed to do. And Jackson does that at First Bull Run. Boom, boom. Mm-hmm. And then I have not done enough research to know why it, I would say, devolved into standing there for 2+ hours and not taking pot shots, but slamming each other. I don't get that kind of endurance, how they did it psychologically or physically. But so, I mean, by Gettysburg, you've got these guys standing there for 6 hours in some cases. Iron Brigade did. Then they had to take several different lines of battle as they withdrew on the first day, but they're in it for 6 hours. And that's where you get the high casualties mounting up. Maybe people can say that since the bayonet was disliked by volunteers, I don't, it's hard to tell. I think the bayonet was used a little more than we think. That we always have those stories about the bayonet being used as candlesticks and everything. But I had a friend, he's passed away since, and he was working on a little vignette about that. And he has a great point. One, the person bayoneting his enemy isn't going to talk about it usually. It's extremely personal. I've only talked to 2 veterans who've discussed, one was World War II, one was Vietnam, who discussed hand to hand. And I've talked to numerous veterans. But the other point is that the guy being bayoneted in the Civil War or anywhere, he's dead. You don't. There's one case in the first Manassas, First Bull Run, where he was a New Yorker. He got bayoneted 13 times and he lived. Obviously, the Confederates were torturing him, because I think anybody can figure out where to bayonet somebody and kill them. So, and the fact that he lost the testy, they were definitely torturing the guy. At any rate, so how much the bayonet was used, it's going to be really tough to get the numbers. And but it, if it had been used, they might not have gone into the entrenchments, but that's not how it. I'm sure the strategy was dictating the tactics. That's how it works in war. The strategy, these guys up here have, this is what's going to happen, and then they have to adapt the tactics. So that's a biggie.
Absolutely, and very interesting points there with the bayonets and just thinking through the use and then maybe the disuse of that.
Yeah, well, it's Spotsylvania. Remember, they're throwing the. I mean, it's gross to think about, but that's the psyche of what happens in combat. You have to kill the other guy, and they're throwing them like spears. So
when I was doing research for my book on Newmarket, one of the gentlemen who was helping me do research, we were at Newmarket Battlefield, and he had a reenactor's rifle. And so we were talking about things, and it was definitely not the first time I'd seen a replica weapon like that, or even the first time I'd handled one. But we were talking about it, and so we were going through a little bit of drill manual, kind of like the Corps of Cadets might have. And so we did, fixing bayonets. And then it was a really interesting experience because he stepped in front of me and he said, "Okay, now hold the gun up," pointed at my chest. I'm like, "Wait, that's not gun safety." He's like, "Oh, it's unloaded. We all know this. I want you to see something." So I did what he told me to do, and it was hard to do. And he's like, "Now think about what it would take to shove this into someone, and then you would have to pull it out." And it was a very difficult thing for me to think about, but it is something that I'm glad I took the time to think about it, because now when I read those accounts from Spotsylvania, or those places where you have some record of bayonet combat, you really have to think about what's going on. And that is another level of viciousness in warfare that's a lot closer than firing at a few hundred yards.
Mm-hmm.
I had 3 points, and I'm going to keep it Eastern Theater as well, and I'll just move through them quickly here. Cavalry goes from wanting to be Napoleonic to very much evolving for the American terrain, which is going to be a lot more of scouting, maybe some rides, maybe some raids, things like that. But there really aren't the great sweeping cavalry charges that we read about in Napoleonic tactics. Cavalry can pursue at the end of a battle. That certainly happened. But cavalry is not used the way the cavalryman romanticizes in 1861. And then one thing that I'm very interested about with artillery is the involvement of it being much more mobile on the field. Again, not the first time it's been done, but ideas that are coming out of the West Point classes, particularly the ones that graduate right before the war, particularly the class of 1861. You have Henry DuPont, you have John Pelham, you've got some other artillery guys in there as well. And they are really playing around with this idea of mobile artillery. Pelham develops the Stuart horse artillery, Henry DuPont covers a retreat at the Battle of Newmarket, things like that. So they're really coming up with these ideas of moving it for effective firepower. And then for infantry, I was thinking about the psychological change in warfare. And the point that comes to mind to illustrate it would be Colonel Francis Barlow, who later becomes a general. And he's commanding the 61st New York during the Peninsula Campaign. And in one of his unit's first battles, he is yelling at his men because some of the guys knelt down to one knee. They're in combat. They knelt down, trying to get a little protection, or at least in their minds, think that there's some protection. And he just yells and yells and yells at them. Well, time goes on, and it is some proof to his leadership that he learned as well. But by 1864, when you look at what he's having his troops do, they are allowed to kneel down. They are building trenches. They are figuring out this idea of a wide skirmish line moving through an area. I kind of picture it like a forerunner of some of the advanced infantry lines that we'll start to see like in World War II, things like that. So just kind of that idea of how it changes from being unmanly to take shelter in 1861 or 1862 to you're still a brave soldier if you're in a trench at Petersburg. So just kind of that interesting evolution of thought, I guess. So, all right. Well, any military or battlefield leadership thoughts that we want to kind of wrap up with here before we segue into the next part of our discussion?
Oh, I think, just, the kind of classic example, and we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about it, was Robert E. Lee's devotion to dividing his army. And going against all conventional wisdom in doing so, and how almost every time it pays off for him to do that. And then, I think maybe we talk about maybe they're overconfident going into Gettysburg, and I think Lee certainly leaves Adams County with maybe a feeling that he asked too much of his men, but they'd always sort of pulled off everything he'd asked them to do, and dividing his army and being willing to kind of fly in the face of everything that anyone would told him. You don't want to be in smaller numbers against a larger enemy and all this kind of that Lee was aggressive with a smaller army almost every time, and that he was willing to take risks with it is again like an example of his military ability, that I think certainly is what kind of put him amongst the upper echelon of military thinkers of his era, and why everyone in either army respected him as a military thinker. I think it's just the kind of classic example of leadership that is a result of the war, develops out of necessity, but that is really put into practice well by Lee.
Great point. JoAnna, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just add to that. Lee was not reading Napoleon while he's on campaign. This is, if you look at the Mexican War campaign that he is deeply involved with the flanking movements. He found several routes for Winfield Scott, and it's going to emerge here on the Civil War. So yeah, he perfects it, definitely.
Great points. So it's been really fun to talk about these military aspects, and nice to chat about it with other ladies studying it in the history field. Now, it is Women's History Month, and we are ladies talking about history, which is great. And shout out to Chris Mikowski for giving us this platform and encouraging us to have this discussion and be able to make it publicly available. But we actually haven't talked about women in the historical setting yet. And I think we should use our last few minutes of our recording here to just chat about women during the Civil War era, because they weren't generals on the battlefield. Yes, there were some women who disguised themselves and fought in the ranks, but can we just talk about some women and leadership moments in the Civil War era? I guess there is the military aspect, but there's also some aspects, of course, socially, culturally, and they had some influence in politics. So there's a wide variety of women in leadership in the Civil War, or influencing leadership in the Civil War. So let's throw that out there as a topic and see what comes to the discussion. Anyone want to go first?
My first thought was Elizabethckley, who is, of course, the sort of the servant in the Lincoln White House, an African-American woman who works for the Lincoln family, is in the White House, is like at the epicenter of sort of politics, but who's also in Washington, D.C., which as a city during the Civil War undergoes such a tremendous transformation with first sort of congressional abolition in the district, and then the huge number of African-American refugees who end up in and around Washington, and especially at Arlington, where there's a giant freedmen's village that springs up. And Keckley becomes involved in freedmen's relief societies sort of during the war. And she rallies other women in Washington, D.C. to take part in this, and kind of helps to create this reform initiative. Of course, we think of this as an era of reform, and in that spirit of reform, and it's happening all across the United States. But I think it's especially remarkable that she took that on as, you know, an African American woman who really helped to create a community in the wake of emancipation. Like, no one knows exactly kind of how things are going to move forward or what's going to happen, but she took that initiative and was sort of integral to helping to create a community for people who were experiencing freedom for the first time. So I think for her efforts in Washington and her wonderful memoir, which gives you kind of inside the Lincoln White House, but also just that great history of the dawn of the Emancipation era, she's certainly someone that I would look at as a Civil War leader and a woman who really, who from the war kind of became, you know, this kind of remarkable figure. So.
Great point, and so much to look at there. And I like how you pointed out that she was helping to organize other women to help with these reform efforts and, you know, supporting the war effort and things like that. So definitely leadership there, just not in the military sense, but that's what we find with women's history during the Civil War period. It's a different era, it's a different culture, but there's definitely leadership happening. JoAnna, do you have some examples or a story that you would like to share?
I'm not going to go with a specific name, but all the unnamed women who helped take care of the wounded and who opened or were forced to open their houses to the wounded and had their houses wrecked in the interim. It's just taking care of wounded is extremely difficult, and it's not a neat process. Bullet wounds they have to heal from the inside out. The amputations. So I just was thinking, you know, how many, you know, Southern women, especially because that's where the campaigns were, had to open their houses to you know, Northern soldiers, and the Confederates, and, you know, help take care of them. You know, the women of Sharpsburg, and then the women of Gettysburg. It's a huge disruption. And, you know, the same thing with Sharpsburg and Gettysburg. The Northern women are taking in the Confederate men, and a lot of them were mortally wounded. Your KIA is actually the less number than your mortally wounded. So how many of these unnamed women helped comfort these young men who were 18, 17, 16, 14, you know, just in their last days. So there's a lot of history that we'll never get, which is kind of frustrating, but at the same time, it's humbling.
Absolutely. And what a beautiful way to word it there. Frustrating, and yet we know enough that it is humbling to think about what these ladies in the past went through and, you know, supported soldiers through. My idea that I wanted to tie in is a little bit similar to JoAnna's, but looking at women who were involved in organized relief efforts. And that might be as simple as showing some leadership and putting together a sock knitting society in your little tiny village. Or you think about the women in the cities who were helping to head up the sanitary commission committees in the northern cities, or in the South where the relief committees were more by state instead of a national effort. You know, you have ladies in the Georgia Relief and Hospital Association who are doing a lot of work on the home front and organizing other women and sometimes civilian men into these efforts of getting supplies to where they're needed in camp or in hospital. And then also just the personal leadership that we can see in lives of women both North and South, because in that era, the man was, of course, the head of the household. Well, if the man is off to war, you look at so many letters where women are trying to figure out how to run the farm, how to keep the family store open, and yet they step into those roles and are able to do that and are able to take care of their family while their man is at war, and maybe even for the rest of their lives if he doesn't come home. There's a set of letters that I find really interesting. It's by a couple who lives in the lower Shenandoah Valley, and he's off to war. He goes to Harper's Ferry early when the recruiting happens in 1861, and he keeps writing these letters back to his wife. And he's giving her advice on how to run the farm in the beginning. And she's clearly like writing and kind of asking some questions and things like that. Her background is she was a bit of a city girl who had kind of recently married. So she was still adjusting to farm life and kind of that circle of tasks and things like that. Well, as the summer progresses, the tone of her letters changes. And instead of asking for advice, she's writing to tell him how great the farm is doing and how good the crop is looking, and that she hired these guys to shear the sheep and she's going to hire them to harvest the wheat and things like that. There's a really fascinating statement that he makes in one of his letters. He says that when he comes back, he's going to ask her for advice on running the farm. And it makes you smile, because it's like, here, she probably didn't want to run that farm. She probably wanted to stay, taking care of the kids and doing the household chores, but she has to step up and into this role. And it's a really interesting way that we see women showing leadership skills, not in politics, not even taking care of wounded or things like that, but just very personal for their household, for their family. So those are the thoughts that I had there. So. Well, this has been a great discussion, and we've covered a lot of ground. We are kind of approaching the time limit that Chris Mikowski gave me, so I think it's about time to wrap up. But maybe we want to go around one more time, and do we want to share maybe some inspiration or something that is inspiring you in Women's History Month, and then we'll wrap it up. So, JoAnna, do you want to go first? Some inspiring words to share with our listeners, or maybe something that has inspired you.
That has to do with women?
Well, just how about women working in the history field like we are? Something like that, along those lines?
Well, it's good that there are a few of us still. I work in the history field as a hobby right now. So okay. It's a tough field. Yeah, no, it's a tough field to get into. At the same time, it's still rewarding. Yeah, I'm sorry. My inspiration is gone. No,
it's okay. We're all at different places in our lives, and sometimes we go through periods, and that's okay. We're really glad that you are part of the emerging Civil War community, and I'm inspired by the way you talk about strategy and tactics with the leaders and how you share that on the blog. So thank you, JoAnna. Cecily, do you have something you want to share, or?
Sure. I thought it might be nice to name some female historians of the Civil War, sort of past and present, that, listeners or readers of the blog might go and check out. And they've certainly been influential in my life. I think someone we forget about today, but who was an incredible early female historian of the war, is Ella Lawn, who wrote what is still the greatest study of desertion during the conflict, and was writing Civil War history at a time when she was pretty much the only woman doing so. So she's someone we should revisit, I think, more frequently, these early women historians of the war. And then in the kind of present day, I'm very lucky to have gotten to know Carol Reardon, who I think is a great example of a woman who works in military history and Civil War history. She's also written books about Vietnam and can sort of go out on a battlefield, if you've ever been on one of her tours, with Army officers, colonels, and sort of stand up to them in terms of what she understands about the war. So she's always been an inspiration for me. And whenever I'm kind of writing military history, I think, would this be up to Dr. Reardon's standard? So she's someone that I always look to. And then, I think Sarah, as you said, the women of emerging Civil War are constantly an inspiration in terms of their creativity, their deep knowledge of the field. And I really appreciate that ECW is a place that is very, very welcoming of that, and of everybody being in the same sandbox, regardless of kind of what you're studying or what you want to do, and that women can be military historians at ECW, and then no one bats an eye. So I love that too.
Yes, that's a really great part of our community. And I just want to thank you, Cecily, for sharing your insight and your enthusiasm for what we're doing here at Emerging Civil War. So it's all greatly appreciated. I'd like to give a shout out tonight to Meg Groeling, who was one of the first ladies who joined the guys at Emerging Civil War. And she has blog posts going back to, I don't want to name a year and name the wrong year, because otherwise she will gently yell at me. But she has blog posts that go back a long way. And in fact, one of the all-time most read posts on the blog is called War Chicken. And go look it up if you haven't. It's about Robert E. Lee and his chicken. It is one of the most popular of all time posts on Emerging Civil War blog. Meg was supposed to be able to be with us in our conversation tonight, but she wasn't feeling well, and we're wishing her good health in the coming days. And just a shout out to her, because if you've had the opportunity to chat with her or meet her, she is very welcoming and also very encouraging of women doing military history or civilian history in the Civil War community. So that's going to wrap up our conversation for this podcast. So joining me this evening, I had Cecily Zander Nelson, JoAnna McDonald, and I'm Sarah Kay Bierle, filling in on the Emerging Civil War podcast. So we will see you online or on the battlefield.